and a debut novelist. We're going to do her launch next March. Isn't that exciting?
What's the title? Okay.
Ah, wonderful. Well, I'm chatting along. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming out. It's only 102, so I really appreciate your attendance, and I hope we aren't losing Megan, who's really not used to this. Anyway, thank you, virtual audience, for joining us. And we're here to talk about Beware the Woman. There are all kinds of interesting things to discuss. There's some very serious issues in it, but I thought we might start by talking about, because it's been described as a Gothic, which is a term that has come back into play. And if any of you have been watching conversations I've had with J.T. Ellison and Jane Ann Krentz and other people on Zoom, you will know that we have thrashed away at what is a Gothic, because it's a term I think often misapplied. So what is it you think a Gothic is? And then we'll sort of get at it.
Those were some of the classic Gothic novels, which I guess would be Jane Eyre, the Bronte, sort of way back, and then certainly up through Daphne du Maurier are all the stories of family secrets, sort of women-centered, psychological.
Wait, we've turned it on.
Okay, so I'll start that again. Going back to the Brontes and up through Daphne du Maurier, and I guess the common thread is usually family secrets, female psychology, often sort of. I sort of consider, like, if you noir is sort of considered the male version, Gothic maybe the female, where it's similar themes of guilt and passion and regret. So I think it's sort of one of those terms they say, like pornography, you know it when you see it, and when you're reading a Gothic novel, you know it because things get sort of dark and stormy and turbulent pretty quickly, and the secrets are unearthed as you go.
Well, no question that secrets are involved, but I think it also involves a landscape. I mean, most Gothic novels are set within some kind of a structure, usually a house, but it could be a castle. So we could talk about the fall of the House of Usher. We could talk about Rebecca, which, the whole point of Rebecca is Manderley. She doesn't even have a name except Mrs. De Winter. And when the house burns down, that's the end of Rebecca. So in your case, you have chosen, instead of Cornwall or Yorkshire, which is, the kind of remote country landscapes that the Brontes and Du Maurier and all have talked about, you've chosen Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which I think is a really interesting choice. Why?
I grew up in Detroit, which is sort of the other end of Michigan, but the UP, as they call it, or the Upers, is what they call the people that live up there, what they call themselves, was really exotic place to, it's very beautiful and remote and has these sort of famously long winters that are sort of terrifying to those of us downstate. So as a kid, we would go up there, or we'd go to Mackinac Island, which is right before you get there, to the Grand Hotel, which, if you've ever seen the movie Somewhere in Time, that's sort of where it's famously set.
Rockers on the porch, right?
Yes, exactly. So I think it had, I guess, a lot of those sort of haunting qualities of the moors, of the Brontes and so forth, and it also is a little much like Cornwall or the moors of Bronte. It's the people are a little different. There's a different slang and lingo, and a lot of people do come from Cornwall. They came over as miners to work in the mines, so there is, until you mentioned that, I didn't even put that together, but I think that is sort of part of it. It sort of does have some genealogy with the real Gothic tradition. So it's a place that you feel a little like you don't quite belong, you don't quite understand, and so that's where I wanted to put the main character.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a certain amount of isolation involved, and then, as you say, there's not just isolation of the landscape, but sort of a closed community.
Yes, exactly.
So you could be on the Yorkshire moors, it could be down there, in the sweeping whatever of Cornwall. I've been to all those places, and I'm trying, but that is the characteristic that really stays with me, is the isolation. And then, as a consequence, the communities tend to be very close together because there's nothing really around them, and they depend upon mutual support.
Yes, and there's sort of a little distrust of outsiders or
Mm.
people that sort of they have all these terms for people that come up in the summer or come up in the winter just to ski that they're not sort of real U peers. And so there's a little bit of that tension in the air between the downstaters and the U peers. It's very insular and kind of clannish community.
So it's perfect for your story.
Yes.
Right. And then not only that, you've created a family home, compound, whatever you want to call it. So that kind of takes place of the, the building, the castle or the Moore house or whatever it might happen to be. So who are your characters in this book?
So it's JC is the main character, and she's sort of newly married, newly pregnant, and she's married to Jed. She's very much in the sort of love bubble of early romance, and this is their first road trip they have ever taken together to go to the Upper Peninsula to visit Jed's dad, Dr. Ash, who is sort of a very charismatic figure and very overpowering presence in Jed's life. So it was a lot of that sort of first encounter is a lot about how, when you first meet your significant other in the context of their family, and then you really see whole different sides of them because you sort of see this sort of family dynamics that can definitely play a role. So this is the first time JC's ever really seen her new husband Jed with his father, and so he sort of seems different somehow, and she can't quite get a beat on it, and that's sort of where things start. It's the three of them together, and then the fourth character is another classic Gothic character, which is the caretaker,
Right. The
Mrs. Brand.
housekeeper.
Yes,
Yes.
yes, exactly.
Exactly.
Yes, who emerges quickly as a sort of mysterious figure in the house. So the more I talk about it, it's all the Gothic tropes.
It really is. I love it. But you've introduced, some timeless yet modern themes. So
Yeah.
when we meet JC, when we see her starting on this trip, she's pregnant.
Yes.
So she's in a more vulnerable state than if she had
Yeah.
been not pregnant.
Exactly. And first time pregnancy and sort of unprepared for the amount of attention she gets as the bearer of the grandchild. And it was sort of inspired by this sort of online query I saw on Twitter where this woman was asking, am I a bad person because I don't want my family in the delivery room with me when I give birth, because her husband and her father-in-law had so many opinions about her pregnancy that they were sort of driving her crazy. And in some ways that's sort of the situation JC suddenly finds herself in, is that everyone is very focused on her pregnancy. And the way that we treat pregnant women too, with this sort of touching, always feeling like we can touch their body and give opinions on what they should be eating or their physical activity. And so she's sort of it's another area where she sort of feels thrown because she's not used to that.
Well, I mean, basically, she's hosting a stranger,
Yes,
you know.
that's right.
So, you're incubating another life.
Right. Yeah.
And some people deal with that better than others.
Yes.
But, it's scary. It's scarier the first time because there's
Yeah.
so many
Yeah.
unknowns. But it always makes me feel about, queens were obliged to give birth in public so everybody could be sure that the baby was
Oh
actually
yeah.
the baby, the famous warming pan baby trope that drove the Glorious Revolution, got James II off the throne because his second wife, refused to give birth in public. And so the rumor started that the baby was brought into the birth chamber in a warming pan. And that's how they got rid of the Stuarts, or at least that Stuart. We got Mary and then we got Anne. And then because they decided he really wasn't a Stuart baby, they brought in George I, the Hanoverian. So it really,
Wow.
could be, she
Yeah.
could have prevented much of that if she had been willing. But I mean, who wants to give birth in public? I
I
mean,
know.
I've
Seems
given birth
sensible.
twice, and I certainly didn't want to do it in public, So,
Yes.
but on the other hand, doing it all by yourself is a really terrifying thought too. So, there's so how far along have you made her when she's making this trip?
So she's sort of at the end of her first trimester, so it's and she hasn't really experienced, the sort of there, some women experience things like morning sickness in the first trimester, and she hasn't really experienced that much. She doesn't feel that changed yet. But then on the trip, she has a little bit of a scare that sort of um, makes everyone very, very pay even more attention to her in the household. So that's sort of I mean, what you said is so interesting because I do think in some ways, she's the outsider, and she also is sort of has the outsider inside her. So there's this sort of
Right.
she's really, I think, doubly disoriented about how to handle it. And I think her husband doesn't quite feel like he's not behaving as he normally behaves, so she doesn't also have him to cling on, and she also has no Wi-Fi, no internet, no phone service, so she can't sort of call her mom as easily or get, so she feels, I think, increasingly isolated the longer
Which
she's
is a
there.
really key Gothic
Yeah,
sort of thing. You have to have somebody in peril and isolated,
yeah,
or, there's no scare
that's
factor
right.
in there. I read I mean, this is a slight diversion, but they had a big study, and I can't remember if it was the Times or the Wall Street Journal last week, about actually the most dangerous time for a woman is not pregnancy and giving birth, but the month after birth, which I had never really thought of. But because of all the hormonal changes and weird things, now you can get postpartum depression, you can have terrible stress on your heart. There are all kinds of things and nobody really treats women. Well, that's not
Yeah.
the point of your book, but I
No,
just think it's
but
interesting.
it's related, I
Yeah,
think. I read a lot about this when I was researching it, and there a lot of women during the process of giving birth, there's all kinds of risks of infection and things like
hmm
that, and but sort of people sort of forget once they're given birth, they sort of not tending to the mother as much, and there's just sort of the idea is we just gotta get this baby out of this person, and then she can sort of fall victim to a lot of these dangers, both psychological and physical. So it is a sort of
yeah.
fraught. Um, and if you have other sort of things working against you, socioeconomically too, I think particularly so because they push you out of the hospital so quickly.
Well, there was a doctrine for centuries. I won't mention which religion, but you can figure it out. And I edited a book about it once where a Jewish woman was pregnant, and the only people to help her give birth were nuns. And she went and hid because the doctrine was that in a case of peril, you save the baby because the baby hadn't been baptized and you let the mother go, which I think is a horrendous,
Yeah,
doctrine, but nonetheless was true. So
yeah,
in this particular book, the Jewish woman who was having a complicated pregnancy, this is like in the 1200s medieval book, went and hid because she was so sure that if anything went wrong, that,
right,
she wouldn't survive, but the baby
right.
would in order to be baptized,
Wow.
which she didn't want to happen anyway because,
Right.
she wasn't of that faith. So there's always been a kind of awful decision about in case of trouble, who do you save, the
Yes.
mother or the
Right.
baby?
That's right. That's right. And like so many Gothic novels, this sort of bloodline and what it means, that's also a large piece of it too. So it always
Right.
seems to emerge.
But I have to look at my notes real quick. Okay, so beware the woman. But you say in an interview, which is a
Yeah.
great interview, I'm cribbing from it. A line came to me, we all marry strangers.
Yes.
So what does that actually mean?
Yes. Someone did say this to me before I married my first husband. But I had sort of made I had said we had married rather quickly. I was very young, and I said, well, it's not like I married a stranger. I was already living with the person I married, and this person said to me, "We all marry strangers," and that stuck in my head like these things do forever, and eventually becomes a part of the book. But I think the notion is that there's this kind of love blindness that you kind of have just to hurl yourself in this because people do change over time. Life change. You never really fully know someone, and the relationships are complex and intricate, and that's sort of one of the sort of beauties and terrors of marriage. I think is that there can be those moments when either the other person has changed or they reveal something to you that they've never revealed, and you feel like you don't know this person. I always think of it's something they use a lot in science fiction or horror movies or alien movies or possession movies as this sort of like the, when the person that, is your husband or wife has either been bitten or zombified or something. And it takes advantage, I think it takes good advantage of our vulnerability, our feeling. It's our greatest fear, right? The person we trust the most and know best could suddenly be changed and try to kill you in the case of vampires or
Right.
aliens.
Oddly enough, I just because I'm launching him tomorrow, I just read Jim Patterson and Brendan Dubois' new book
Yes.
called Crossdown, and the entire theme of the book, and it's on a big government scale, is who can you trust? And basically, there is no one to trust in this book,
Yeah,
and it's constantly evolving. I mean, spy novels run on that, don't they? Most of the time, spy
yes,
novels, you're never entirely sure who the mole is or
that's
what's
right.
going on, but that's on a really big scale. But in your
Yes.
book, it's on a
Smaller, yes.
yeah. But what brings that to a head is the second issue that you've talked about a lot, which is, how the parent-child relationship, that can be the moment and when you think that maybe you don't know the person you married because
Yes.
the person now with the parent as opposed to the person not with the parent,
Yes.
that
Yes.
you married can be very different. So that's a big theme in this book, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it's sort of, I didn't plan this, but both JC and Jed both were raised only children of single parents. So there's a special closeness that they each have with their parent. Um, and of course, JC knows hers with her mom, and her mom sort of is a figure in the book, mostly on telephone or memory. But Jed's with his dad is quite complex, and yes, and JC has no experience. She just knows that he's this sort of impressive figure, and that Jed in some ways is maybe, he's a doctor, and Jed is makes neon signs for a living. He's not, he's not it's a very different kind of profession, and it lives a very different kind of life. But also that notion that this is a little old fashioned, but I remember the notion that if you want to know the man you marry, if you want to know what they're going to be like, look at the father, and that this is
Or
some
the
kind of,
mother,
or the
of
mother.
course.
Yes, it's
Yes, I
true,
know.
exactly, and that there will be sort of these cues, or and I think that's sort of part of JC's discovery, because Dr. Ash does seem so charming, but she can't figure out why Jed seems so anxious around him and desirous of his attention. I was at an event last week where someone was comparing it to Succession with Logan Roy and his son Kendall. That there's this intense a relationship that sort of
And you
can't
know
be
what? That's a
solved.
real life drama. If any of you paid any attention to the Redstone drama,
Yes.
or probably the Murdoch drama,
Right.
which may
Yeah.
unfold, when Rupert goes,
Yes. Yes.
it's actually a real life kind of a thing. It's not
Yes.
just television as
That's right.
Succession.
And it is very gothic in its own
It
way.
really is. My husband's binging on Game of Thrones because he's had surgery and he can't do anything. So he's lying there, in his chair with his headphones on, going through and talk about, that's a classic of
Yes.
this kind of
Yes.
thing. I keep going by it and seeing that the characters are revolving. I don't have any idea what's going on.
Yeah. No, but it's similarly with bloodlines, right? And
Yeah.
lots of isn't there a lot of incest on it too? I mean,
I
there's
don't know. I've never
yeah,
watched
I
it.
think there, yes, people are nodding their head, yeah, which is sort of true of a
Yeah.
lot of Gothic novels too. Not this one, but
Well, but then again, that's a real life thing. The
it
War of the
is.
Roses,
That's right.
the whole thing that went on between the Tudor side, or sorry, the Lancaster side and the York side that
Right.
finally ended with the Tudors was a
That's right.
continual Game of
That's
Thrones.
right. And didn't they all have hemophilia because they were all marrying
No, that's
relations?
Victoria.
Oh, that's right.
No, there wasn't
Okay.
any hemophilia back then. They
Okay.
just cut each other's heads off and, made
Okay.
it even more abrupt. No, there were, and again, it comes back to that when you're talking about succession, the primacy of the bloodline, and especially the male bloodline, because there were very few
Yeah.
that allowed women to rule or take. So primogeniture was basically a
Right.
father to son thing.
That's right. And I think for Dr. Ash too, there is this sort of anxiety that he's sort of losing his son. By his son is married now and has a child, and he's sort of been his whole life. So it's very important to him that this child that he has sort of a place in this child's life, and I think that anxiety feels very real for him too. So everyone everyone has a stake in this child that's not that born, won't be born for many months yet.
So the final question that was arose in this interview. This is a really great interview. I wish I'd been this smart. I could but I really love this. In reading Beware the Woman, part of the horror for me, the interviewer here, was considering the question, what if my husband put me second? Which
Yeah,
comes back to what we were talking about earlier. Who do you save in a difficult situation?
yeah,
Or where does your loyalty lie? To
yes.
your father, to your wife, to your mother, whatever it might happen to be.
Yeah, those are one of those questions that if you're asking yourself it, you really probably don't want to know the answer, right? Because it cuts so much to the core. Because I think we do have this notion of marriage being this sort of way that you sort of weld yourself to this other person and would always be first. But then when child enters the picture, and it is sort of I think something that sort of haunts JC, and I think particularly was on my mind given all in the last 6 or 7 years, these sort of discussions about women's bodies and their
Hmm.
control over it and what it means, and does she just exist to sort of bring this child into the world and then sort of in some ways to be tossed aside, and that she's just sort of this birth giving vessel. And so I think I had not purposely written a book about that, but you know how that stuff, you're sort of, when you're thinking about it, kind of feeds its way in. I think looking back on it, that was very much one of my fears, because there was so much talk about that in the last, let's see, 7 years, about what
Right.
might happen. Yeah,
Well, this is a really, centuries, millennia old
it
subject
is. It is.
from the very beginning. If you read Mary Renault, for example, and
Yeah.
people like that, these same questions kept
That's
arising.
right. No, I think that's the Gothic has always been about that, and just how it never really goes away. I think you're right. It's an eternal.
So, over the course of time, Megan and I first met with her first novel. Actually, we didn't meet, if I remember. Didn't we ship books to you? I can't.
Yes, you did.
Yep.
Yes.
But she wrote a book was like totally different. Then why don't you remind us of it?
Oh,
Because it was a
yes.
long time
I mean, now
ago.
that I think of it, it's not that different, but it seems different
Yeah.
because I'm just remembering the plot now. But it's called Die a Little. It's different because it's set the 1950s and is
Right.
very much sort of the pulp tradition, very much inspired by film noir. But it is about a brother and a sister, and the sister becomes jealous because the brother marries marries a woman that she doesn't trust, who seems like she could be a femme fatale. So, in some ways, we're always
Yep.
writing the same book.
Isn't that interesting? I love Megan's voice. And so she was a first mystery club book back in, when was it?
2005.
Okay,
Yeah.
2005, and it was a standalone book. You're on your third publisher, but this was
Yes.
your first
Yes.
publisher. Anyway, but you're not a series writer. You've written
Right.
a number of things, and you seem to have moved more back towards women's issues from
Yes.
sort of noir more into psychological suspense.
Yeah, and I guess they always feel noir to me, but I guess because noir is sort of a male-dominated genre, I think it looks different. Or maybe I just feel like the fixations are the same, but the style is a little different, and the setting often is a little different, because these are certainly more Gothic settings, and Gothic is usually family-centered and home-centered. But the issues of sort of desire, jealousy, greed, envy are all part of noir and all part of the Gothic at the same time. So maybe it's the sort of same fixations, but with different wrapping paper or something.
Yeah. Well, you're very interested in women's bodies and
Yes,
who controls them because you've
yes,
written about dance and you've written
yes.
about, other that's
Cheerleading and
yep,
yeah, gymnastics.
exactly.
Yeah,
Right. And
that's true.
those are areas where we know from the news that there's been some tremendous discussions about, teachers and students and,
Yes.
the role of
Boy,
coaches
yes.
over and it isn't always men because remember when the last Olympics when the Russian
Yes.
skater didn't or whatever and her coach was a woman and was brutal to her.
Yes.
So it isn't always men and
No.
sex. Sometimes it's just power.
I think so. And I think that notion of female complicity was sort of something I was thinking about a lot with Mrs. Brandt in this book about what, so avoiding spoilers about like what is her role in all this? Is she someone JC should trust or not trust? Because I think that sort of that woman that maybe in this case she's the caretaker, sort of in some ways has less power because she's a servant, but in some ways has more power. And what does she owe another woman? So what do women owe other women is something I think about a lot in the books.
Yeah, that's a really good. Now, there was one more thing that I wanted to mention again. Reading the New York Times this morning, they always have a section in the styles section. Why it's there is a complete mystery to me, about relationships. And this woman has written a very self-pitying. I really didn't like it, and I didn't like. I don't know if you saw it, like her tone, but basically her complaint was that people were always touching her inappropriately. So my first question was, what? How is she going out? I mean, that was sort of, but the scene that really got me is that she was on a flight and some young Italian man she didn't know, she let him massage her back. And when he got up, this is from the story, when he got up to go to the bathroom, an older woman looked over to her and said, "You've never even met this guy. Why are you letting him touch you like that?" So she was
Yeah,
kind of trying to get to her
yeah,
journey where, she didn't let people touch her. But I
right.
thought the whole thing was just
Oh
really
wow, that's it.
bizarre.
Boy, I think I have my next novel. That's
Well,
so interesting, though.
seriously,
It
it's in
is.
today's style. So, where they have those little love
Yeah.
stories and then the
Oh
bigger
yeah,
one
yeah,
right
yeah,
above. That's
yeah.
the one. And I had so much trouble even sympathizing with her because I thought, how true? Why would you let some complete stranger,
Makes me wonder
do that?
if she has some history that she hasn't dealt with yet, that that she would put herself in that position. That's
Or
so
also what she
interesting.
looks like and how she presents herself. I didn't think, that the way you dress or whatever should invite,
No,
or
right,
it's not
absolutely.
permission for
Right,
people. But
right.
nonetheless, somehow or other, she must have been presenting herself as somebody that some random man would think it was okay to pat her on the butt or,
Yeah.
rub her back or something.
I'm
So
on the wrong flights, I tell you.
I know.
No one's ever offered me a
It
massage.
really, I don't know if any of you remember Twilight. Do you remember the whole Twilight phenomenon? And basically, the thesis of that was that it was okay for young girls to go out dressed, almost naked. And it was the expectation was that everybody would treat them as though they were actually dressed, and the guy would take her home and just give her a little peck on the cheek, regardless of the whole presentation. And there was. Do you remember the fashion that was in play then? Any of you remember fashions that were
But
popular
was
then?
it,
Because they were all incredibly skimpy, semi-transparent, and there was a whole thing about teenage girls going out with almost nothing on, and with the
yeah.
expectation that everyone would behave like a white knight. And I had a lot of trouble with that.
Yeah, I think in some ways it was sort of a kind of, in its own way, a kind of armor. Like I'm empowering myself by, wearing what I want to wear. But it's very complicated, of course. And it is so. You mean Twilight, the book that became the
I
movie series?
do.
It's so interesting because that's a vampire story. So,
Yeah.
you know, it's. I think it's another way that sort of becomes this metaphor too for because that's so tied up with sexuality, vampirism and sexuality,
Yeah.
and yeah, and
But what
in a
about
sense,
signaling? I mean, I
yeah,
have to ask yourself, what kind of signaling is going on? Um,
yeah,
so,
yeah. It's
it's like in the
complicated.
Regency. We've done some Regency things last week. A fashion in the Regency era was for very transparent material, basically muslin. And women would actually, what they said, damp their petticoats. They would actually put on this stuff that you could see through, and then they would get it wet. And then they would go out. So basically they were wearing cellophane. And, I
Wow.
know. And, and yet there was this huge focus upon chastity and,
Yeah.
all the rest of it. And the signaling was so misappropriate,
It's like it's
inappropriate.
like that Victorian era too, where it's sort of so sort of reputation for being puritanical, but it's sort of sex obsessed to culture at the same time. So I think these two are
You're
always
right. There
very
was there
twin.
was more pornography produced
Yeah.
during Victorian times for Victorian men. They had bars they would go to,
Yes.
or
Yes.
clubs or
Yes.
whatever it is. And the
Yes.
whole point was to look at pornography.
Yes.
I know. Well, we've
So, yeah,
gone
we
afield
moved
here.
far
Right.
afield, but
We have.
it's a natural extension, it seems to me.
Well, we're not doing all that in this book. I just these are all just I just think that the issues. It's important to
It
remember
is.
that while you're writing this in a very contemporary,
Yeah.
setting, that the things you're writing about have been there all along.
Yes, I think so. And it felt in some ways with the house that in some ways it kept feeling like we were going back in time because in some ways nothing in the house had changed in decades. And Jed remembers it looking the same as when he was a little boy. So, and as I was writing, it started to feel like it was older and older because there's no modern technology. And so
Right.
I think that notion that we could slip back in time so easily was very much on my mind. So I think it's apt.
Wonderful book. Lots of things to chew over. So
Yeah.
Megan has written a lot of books that she has not been able to talk to us about because we don't see her all that often. So Patrick and I are going to swap seats here because he's more familiar with some of her earlier
More
work than I am.
a little noir.
A little noir, Patrick's natural milieu.
Right. Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about was our shared love of true crime.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, most of my books sort of there's some true crime that I'm fascinated by, and sort of weaves its way into the book. Less so this one, though there are a few, but it was my first love. Even as a kid, I was that weirdo kid that would get the true crime paperbacks at the drugstore and just always loved them. And when I think about it now, I think it felt like it was a window into the real world, and it's not necessarily the violence of the crimes, but that that women, I think 3 times as many women read true crime as men, and I think there's a reason because
Is
I
that
think
right? I didn't know
yeah,
that.
it's
That's interesting.
staggering numbers, and I think it's because my theory, at least, and working theory is that it's because there are stories about the things that women aren't supposed to talk about, often domestic abuse, family trauma, past sexual abuse, these sort of things that emerge, and it's not the crime itself necessarily, but these sort of things that that emerge when you read about them, and female rage, competition among women. I think that's all sort of the stuff of great true crime, and I think that you sort of it was a way of finding yourself somehow in those books. So I think that's why they may speak more to. I mean, they speak to a lot of people, but I think maybe that's one of the reasons they speak especially to women.
So you say that was your first love?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes.
When did you start
Other
reading
than
true
Jeff
crime?
Millenbach in kindergarten, it was very cute.
I also
But
wanted to I
yeah.
also wanted to show I have a copy of this really
Oh
cool
yes.
anthology. I don't know if you all have seen this, The Hell of a Woman, um, that Megan edited, and Barbara actually has a short piece
Yes,
in there
yes.
too, right? Yeah, pretty cool. Um, but what so with true crime, and then we'll get into because your work draws on so many different influences. There's classic noir. There's I see a European literary thread going through in some ways too.
Mhm.
Um, but what were some of your gateways for true crime?
True crime. Certainly the first one was, I think, a lot of people of my generations, which was Helter Skelter, which was the book that was everywhere when I was a kid. And you remember they had the pictures section in the middle, and you would see the crime scene photographs, but they were expurgated, so you couldn't see everything. But that somehow made it more tantalizing. What am I not seeing? And that was sort of Charles Manson was the boogeyman of my childhood. Even I didn't grow up in the West Coast, but he was international. Let's be honest. So that was really big. And then it really was a lot of the Anne Rule ones, Stranger Beside Me, and Small Sacrifices, which was the one about the woman who murdered her children. And they were all really, and then a lot of them through James Ellroy's true crime pieces that he wrote at that time. And that really brought me into noir because they were Black Dahlia and those sort of cases. So, I have this group thread with several other female crime writers where we all talk about the latest true crime that we're following together, and we all try to crack the case together. And So it sort of never really has gone away. And there's some that I'm not interested in all. And I don't know if this is true for you. Do you have like just have certain elements draw you where some stories don't care that much about, or
I think so. I mean, I think there are. I'm not particularly interested in mob stories.
Yeah, me either. Yeah.
I don't know why. I just don't find them that interesting.
They
Um,
tend to be the same story, maybe in
yeah,
some ways,
yeah.
or maybe they saturate the.
And then the
Yes,
shark. And to me, mob stories are more about the shark and not nearly as interesting as the good bad kitty story that you mentioned. Maybe
that's right.
you don't care.
Well, I mean, when the motive is just simple greed,
Yeah,
um, in a
that's
lot of
right.
cases, it's the
Yeah.
shark. Yeah. I like what I like about true crime. I think I never really had to articulate it, but I just like the ordinary person
Yeah.
when put under the right amount of stress and the right amount, and what we're all capable of.
Yes.
And in there somewhere is that shadow side that we all
Yes.
have, although we try not to admit it.
Yes.
I think true crime, those kind of stories interest me.
I think that it reminds me, of course, the book I wrote about the famous Phoenix true crime, the Winnie Ruth Judd murders. It was a classic case of that because I think under any other circumstances, what happened to her wouldn't have happened. But these series of circumstances drove her to or didn't, depending on your theory about the case, to this violent act. Do any of you know the story of the Winnie Ruth Judd story? So so she was accused of murdering two women she lived with and chopping them up and putting them in trunks, and hence she was called the trunk murderess because she was trying to move the bodies. There was a man involved, and there's lots of theories about the case. But this was in 1930s Phoenix, and it was um, a really big tabloid scandal of the day, and sort of she's a haunting figure. And but I remember when we did the event here for that, and some people remembered it, or knew some of the people involved. It was
Do you remember
thrilling.
that there was a woman that I had kind of lost touch with her, but she knew Jack Halloran,
Yes, the
and we went
man.
out and had dinner with her. It was
Yes.
fascinating.
Yeah, so he was the homme fatale. He was the of that case, and she said that I think she met him in his no, maybe six, he was in a aged facility when she met him, and she said he could still charm the pants off every nurse in the place. So
Yeah.
he was not a good guy.
Yeah, but it's a fascinating story, and I
Yeah.
like how you recreated it, and yeah, we had fun doing a kind of a Phoenix crime tour of all the sites.
Yes.
And it's funny because on my walk, I walk in my little neighborhoods, and I live like right around the block from Jack Halloran's old house, and some of those, I think about it a lot. I
Yeah.
walk by it all the time, and the 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 house or the duplex
Yes.
on Thomas and Second Street narrowly avoided being razed a few years ago when they took the entire block and they turned it into this massive condo development. And there were a couple other really neat 20s. I realize we're digressing. I'm sorry,
But
but
it's of local interest,
there were a
right?
couple of other really cool 20s era bungalows that weren't protected that were destroyed. But that one on the corner, through I think it was a lawyer who purchased it,
Oh,
who was
really?
obsessed with the case, and thanks to him, it survives.
Well, I think that sort of speaks to what you're talking about. When you go to the house, in this case, it's these three women, this is the height of the Depression. Two of them have tuberculosis. They're basically surviving with the gifts of men. And you see how small the house is and the conditions that they were living under and how desperate it was for a woman in that era with no one protecting her. And it really changes the way you think about the story. And I think that's speaks to some of these true crime fascinations is when you sort of touch the reality of it, it's very different often. Right. Exactly. And they would lugged it, yeah. Yeah, everyone was like, how did she get it on the train? How did she, it was this mysterious
Yeah,
case.
absolutely. I still think the truth has yet to
I think
really
so.
come out about it. I
Yes.
mean, there's Jana's version, which
There's a book, yeah, there's
Is
a nonfiction book about it.
yeah, it's an amazing book.
It is, yeah.
I don't know if it's the whole story, but we'll see.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll see. But okay, so tell me a little bit about. I just wanted to kind of go down memory lane and
Yes.
go through some of your early work. And so I didn't realize true crime was first. I thought that kind of noir fiction was the gateway to true crime. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I certainly film noir was first. So if we're talking about movies, but I didn't really know the books until later. But I loved watching those old, first gangster movies. So Public Enemy and Scarface, etc. But then The Big Sleep and Out of the Past, but I didn't really. Yeah, the books really did come later, and they really came through Elroy or reading some more contemporaries that would speak about their love of Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler. And then when I read those in my late teens, that was really when that was the true love. When I read those and I just wanted to write my way into those books.
And so your first published book was your dissertation, right?
Yes.
For your PhD.
Yes, I don't recommend it, but
And it was
it's
called
just very dense.
The Street. Yeah.
That's right. I forgot about that. Yes. It's the gateway, unlikely gateway, but that's good
So
company.
Can you just tell us just a little bit about that? The Street Was Mine, right?
Yes, it was essentially about the tough guy figure in hard-boiled fiction and film noir, and the sort of reputation of the tough guy, this Bogart guy, as being sort of really sort of tough and cool and unbeatable, but when you really look at some of the movies, but especially the books, they're really mostly a mess. Philip Marlowe is sort of a disaster. He's always, he barely solves the case. Usually the case just sort of reveals itself because someone tried to shoot him. And he's often, very destabilized by women, very terrified of women. And Dashiell Hammett, Sam Spade character is kind of a sadistic creep. I mean, I love all these characters, by the way, I should clarify, and certainly all James M. Cain. If you've ever seen The Postman Always Rings Twice or Double Indemnity, those guys are all saps and they're messes, and women just completely run a number on them. So how tough are these guys? So the argument was that they were not so tough, and that was what made them interesting. That it was really sort of this perilous moment for masculinity coming out of first the Depression and then coming back from the war, where all these men felt that's sort of the argument about how a film noir begins, is that they came back from the war and they felt that their wives or their women had cheated on them and taken their jobs, and then they came back with nothing, and so then they had to kill a lot of people.
And of course, they didn't talk about it.
Exactly.
That generation just
Exactly.
swallowed it with alcohol, and
That's right. And they just didn't even have the word for PTSD or any of that. It was long before that. So you see characters like, actors like Robert Ryan sort of always playing
Right.
these tortured vets, or Dana Andrews, a tortured vet.
And they were tortured vets.
Yes.
I mean, Robert Ryan in particular, right? And
Yes.
and also Lee Marvin.
Yes.
Yeah, a lot of that has come out about that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sterling Hayden,
Oh.
all just
Love Sterling Hayden.
the best.
Has anybody seen, and we'll digress some more, those great interviews he did with Tom Snyder?
They're amazing.
They're so good.
They're on
like-
YouTube, and he was a novelist as well.
Yeah.
He wrote these seafaring novels, a very complicated guy, and tortured by guilt over naming names or
That's right.
yeah. I mean, he wasn't as egregious as some of them, but he felt guilty enough that he had not refused to speak at all, so.
His memoir, The Wanderer, is really
Yes,
something.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, so that I'm just trying
We're
to.
getting deep in noir now.
Yeah, I know it's an endless place to go, but it's fascinating. And so let's go a little bit. So Die a Little, you mentioned
Yep.
your first novel. After that, The Song Is You,
Yes. Based
and
on a
that
true
also
crime,
based on a
yes.
true case,
Yes.
kind of roughly the same time as the Dahlia case.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that's also, if any of you have read the book or seen the movie, not a great movie, but Black Dahlia, but it is based on this very famous, iconic Los Angeles case of a starlet who goes missing and then is found sort of horribly murdered. And in the case of The Song Is You, it was a, and some people have connected, they think it's the same person that killed all these women were missing 46, 47, right after the veterans coming back from the war in Los Angeles. So she was
Not
in
Hodel, I hope.
I mean,
No.
it's an open question. Yeah, that's one of the theories of Black Dahlia is that this doctor named Hodel. I'm sure you probably have that book here, the Black Dahlia Avenger, but no. But he was a suspect. But we're getting really deep in the. But anyway, so it's about one of those cases, and it sort of permitted me to enter that. Really try to bring the victim to full center of the story, you know, because often in these stories the dead woman is sort of the occasion for tortured male detectives or cops to sort of talk about themselves and fetishize the beautiful dead woman. In this case I wanted it to focus on the Jean Spangler herself and imagine what her life was like. So that was the idea there.
And then we have this slim little subversive novel called Queen Pin,
Yes.
which was so awesome. Talk about that.
Still, that feels like that my book that most is a gateway one. I'm so grateful for that book because it's so short that people think, well, I'll try one of hers, and they like that one. But it was very much really just wanting to write a pulp novel, and it is, but like the classic male aging criminal takes on a young protege, but I just flipped the genders. So it's a woman in the grand tradition of the women that moves money for the mob, and she takes the protege under her wing, and then a man becomes involved, and things go terribly awry. And that has been the book of mine that has been never not been under option for. It still hasn't been made, but that has always been under option, and I'm not involved in it, but for TV and movie, because I think um, that there hasn't been that story yet on the big screen, and I always hope it will be because it's such a quick and dirty little book and so cinematic, I guess, because I was so inspired by those pulp novels that always things move very fast, very violently, and it got me. It was a chance to sort of see if those same tropes of pulp worked if you flipped the gender, and it turned out it's exactly the same because it's about, as Barbara was saying, it's about power ultimately, and if you switch, it's still the same story. There's still money in a bag, and everyone wants the money, or there's someone that they both won, and only one of them is going to get that person, and whether it's male or female, all plays out the same.
Um, let's see. So, and then there was this kind of transition where you went to one of my favorites of your book, The End of Everything. Just a wonderful book. Have you guys read that? Wow. Um, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about. I understand that there's some elements of your own childhood,
Yes.
the just the vibe, the whole feel, and you grew up
Yes.
in Michigan,
Right.
Detroit.
Yeah.
Um, talk about kind of making that transition, going from
Yeah.
this sort of very old school retro, historical
Right.
pieces into this contemporary with a young adult kind of
Yeah, yeah, it's
character.
really about 13-year-old girls and a kidnapping, and it's very much, I mean, it's been called sort of suburban Gothic, so I guess that was sort of my first move where I would get renamed. And it's funny, I really struggled. I wanted to write something closer to my life because it felt like it's good to keep taking risks as an author, and it's sort of, I didn't want to I'll only write books that were about movies I loved, so, but I didn't know how to make the move. But then this was so personal, and to me, the closest thing to noir that you get now is being a teenage girl, because everything feels very heightened and intense, and it's very much about um, desire and yearning and confusion and fear, and everything just feels like it could fall apart at any minute. And so it felt like it felt so natural to slide into a 13-year-old girl's view of the world. And then everything, once I had those those glasses on, so to speak. Of course, nothing's more terrifying than the suburbs. As someone who grows up in the suburbs, because everything is so hidden. All the people pull the blinds, and you don't know what goes on in every house. And it was certainly that way in my childhood. And eventually you'd find out years later, oh, in this house, this was going on, and this husband was cheating on his wife, and these two were swingers, and you find out all this stuff afterward. And so everything sort of fell into place, and I realized that I could write something more contemporary, which was
So
really
there is definitely a voyeuristic kind of
Yes.
rear window
Yes.
quality to all this.
yes, yes. So writers are always voyeurs, I guess, at heart.
Now, do you have brothers and sisters?
I have one brother who is a prosecutor, so he is very helpful with my true crime and all my criminal questions. And the one thing he always tells me that's so useful, because they always finds problems, of course, especially in movie versions of how cases get solved, is that first of all that criminals are much more dumb in real life. And then in the movies, they are never Hannibal Lecter. They are always in that second. Mostly the cops do know who did it. They just can't make the case, and it's one of the things why you see cop. I mean, he's a prosecutor, so he's always going to be very much on that side. But that they do know, and that the great frustration for cops, of course, is that they can't make the case. And as a prosecutor, he's very sympathetic to that, and that all this technology that they always show on TV, that no police department, no local forensics department, none of them ever have that kind of equipment at all. They have tiny budgets. They can't afford any of these elaborate things you see on TV. So real police work has really mostly got to solve the case. This stuff isn't going to the FBI. It's not going to DC and they're running it through these systems. That's just too expensive.
Interesting. Now, Detroit itself, seems to me, I've never really spent much time there, but I'm fascinated with it. It seems like, in some ways, we were talking about Pittsburgh last night a little bit. It seems like one big film noir set, Detroit.
Elmore Leonard has made good use of it.
Yes,
in
and
that
other
way,
authors have too.
Yeah.
But the fact that, it went into this decline.
Yes.
And, there are all these abandoned, wonderful old buildings everywhere. I've seen videos, and I understand this has changed quite a bit, but, let's say 15 years ago.
Yes.
There's a video where you can go, I can't remember, somebody's driving through, I don't know the neighborhoods.
Yeah, but there's some of the famous, like the River Rouge plant. They would go through Auto Plant. These grand structures that, or some of these civic buildings, and you're just going through the hollows of it. It's called sort of ruin porn now, because it's sort of, but it is quite beautiful. But it is sort of, you feel a little uncomfortable sort of finding. It's sort of like a lost city in some ways, the Detroit of the golden age, and it is coming back now. But it's funny that you mention it, because my next book is going to be set in suburban Detroit, and is really set 15 years ago or so with the recession, and is really about that moment, because I do think it's quite evocative and very noir, right?
That lost period is the
Yes.
noir period.
Exactly.
I mean, maybe a little bit later, but who cares, right?
Yeah, it's close enough. But
Yeah.
it is that notion, like this fallen times, that everything was so. This was one of the centers of the world. This was the because it was a one business town, right? It's all auto industry, and once the auto industry left, everything left. And then sort of, we had been talking about Chicago last night, which is a different history, but there are similarities too. Yeah.
World War II really changed Detroit because
Yes.
they had to bring up lots of people from the rural South to run the plants, because so many of the people who manufactured cars were overseas. They got called up, and so it really changed the whole dynamic. But do you remember the August Snow author?
Yeah, Stephen Mac Jones.
Oh yeah.
Detroit is actually, of all the border, it's the most porous border, way more so than our south.
Yes.
Because it's right on the Canadian border, and they can't really patrol the lake. And so remember that?
Well,
But there's a
Joe
lot
Kennedy knew that,
I'd
didn't
say
he?
there was a big bootlegging
Yeah.
hub, and it
Right.
was. And as a teenager, of course, that's what we would just go to Canada to drink beer with.
Really?
It was always very porous. So it is. That's exactly.
Yep.
It is, and that's a sort of another sort of noir quality of it, and that and this sort of big wealth divide that grew because the big auto money was so
Mm.
big, and the gap between the workers and that money is immense. I grew up in Grosse Pointe, which was really where it's where the Fords lived. It was really you just cross you cross 8 Mile Road. Those of you who know, it it changes in a block from Detroit, one of the roughest parts of Detroit for many years, to this unbelievably sort of serene landscape with the lake and these grand
I think
houses.
that was the video I saw. Somebody
That's
making
it.
this
That's
really
it.
short drive.
Yeah.
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 I read an interesting memoir by Wayne Kramer of the MC5,
Oh yeah, it's
and it
Detroit.
was a
Yes.
great book. But he was talking about how Detroit was like this idyllic, almost playground for him when he was in the 50s, let's say
Yes.
when he was a kid, or early 60s. And it was just such a wonderful place. And it was safe,
Yeah.
you know. So maybe I'm romanticizing Detroit,
I
but
don't think so because
the music too, I love from
yes,
Detroit.
and really just this sort of very glamorous culture, and a lot of nightlife and jazz and dance, dance halls, and really in the mid-century, it really was really the place. When you read jazz biographies, that Sonny Rollins is always going through Detroit and playing, and you have this sense of a real culture that just within 10 years after that, everything just sort of got rocked.
Part of it was trying to bridge the wealth gap. The UAW went so hard after wages. I mean, they got it up to like $45 an hour to work on the line, and that's what caused the auto industry to start opening plants in Mexico and other places,
Yeah.
gradually eroding the financial base of Florida. So, I mean, sorry, Florida's doing the same thing.
Yes, no, it was
On
a
my
story of
mind,
America, right?
right?
Yeah, it is a very
I know
American
the world is
story.
Disney. I just could hardly believe it.
Yes, we talked about that last night too. Yeah.
Did you ever read Charles Willeford's Sideswipe?
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
that
Oh
was his
boy.
job. Yeah, amazing book. Um, but as I said, you draw on so many influences in your work, and one of my favorites
Oh
is The
yeah.
Fever. And I
We
want
got a big kick in sales during the pandemic. That
yeah,
one, ironically, yeah.
and I know we're kind of getting short on time here, but I wanted to talk about The Fever, and of course Dare Me, and TV and The Deuce. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so much to talk about. Okay.
Yeah, I mean that really was sort of Dare Me, and then The Fever was sort of both my entree into doing screenwriting, because Dare Me I wrote which is my about the cheerleaders and murder, and The Fever, which is based on a real story of this sort of mysterious illness in upstate New York, that among teenage girls, and they both were in development, and Dare Me eventually got made as a TV series that I got to show run, which was a big thrill. But it really was sort of this teenage girl renaissance, I guess, because they were very much focused on the complicated relationships among young girls and among one another, and really at a moment when there just wasn't that on television at all. So it was very lucky for me, and got because growing up loving movies, the chance to get to write in that space was a big thrill.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about TV writing and about the difference between
Yeah.
the two different forms and
It was a real crash course, I mean, you just sort of they just sort of, okay, write the script. And then you think, oh, I guess I just got to get the software, and what does the script look like? But growing up watching so many movies, I eventually figured my way to it. But it is a matter of thinking much more visually, and novels are so interior, and so they're so intimate, and so you're trying to, especially when you're dealing with Dare Me, it's a first person narrative. Like all my first person narrators, very unreliable. And so how do you convey that? And so you have to start thinking of it differently. But with things like cheerleading or gymnastics, or with illness, they are very visual and cinematic. So you just have to think about a way to tell it in that different way. And you do have this collaborative element if they go forward. And I just had my New York launch last week, and two of the cinematographers and my production designer from Dare Me both came out for the book, and it was so wonderful. And we were all talking about it because they had me always draw how I pictured some of the things in the book in my head, like one of the character where a murder occurs, his apartment and what it looked like, and I still have the drawing. And then 2 weeks later you walk onto set and it's there. You literally walking into this world you created in your head. So, and it's better because they're artists. So that's really so much fun. And so it sort of alleviates the pressures that you do also get in Hollywood that you don't get in publishing to this costs too much, or yes, it's a show about cheerleaders, but you can only afford to have 2 football games in a season, because it's too expensive to rent that football field, and so you just have to how are we going to have a cheerleading show when we don't have football games? But it definitely offsets that to get to work with these great artists, and they were talking about Beware the Woman because the character Jed who makes neon signs, and they were already imagining how to cinematically how to use neon as a way to tell the story. So I love talking to visual people because I'm such a word person.
Just briefly, I wanted to ask you about kind of the intersection between, I don't really have a question form, between virtuosity and ultra competence, with these, obviously gymnastics and
Yes.
ballet, and they're almost like secret societies in a way,
Yes.
where the people are removed from society in a way
Yes.
and make tremendous sacrifices.
Yes.
And then the parents, of course, that whole dynamic. It seems like there is a natural confluence of, I don't know about classic noir, but the stakes are really, really high.
Yes. Yes.
What fascinated you about that?
Yes, I've only slowly started to realize that that's all I write about are subcultures. Because even Beware the Woman, because of the cloistered environment and the different place she's in, and I think I'm fascinated by secret societies where that has not only it's so much fun to research what their lingo is, how they talk, how gymnastics. There's a whole set of whole language, but with ballet even more so because most of it's in French, but there's also its own rules, and they're not the rules of real society, and they're often not the laws of real society, because they always protect their own, and there's competition within, but they draw well, that
I was
is.
going to say the pink wall. That just doesn't sound right.
Or like maybe The Godfather with the closing of the door, like you're not let into this space. And these are mostly female spaces too, so there's an extra quality there. But I think that's sort of wanting to enter, it's the voyeur again, I guess, wanting to go into those places where I'm not supposed to be and that none of us are supposed to be. But it's always so gratifying when someone in that world, like a ballet dancer will say. I remember in my last book, The Turnout, there, I had this thing where, because someone had told me this, that they will put pins in each other's point shoes when they want to take over the lead role, and a couple people like that can't be true. And then I got all these emails from ballet people. They're going to tell you it's not true, but it's definitely true, and it made me so happy because it feels true. Girls are mean.
It seems like in this kind of TikTok era that we're in, the especially the cheerleading world
Yes.
has really taken off, hasn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's absolutely. I'm not on TikTok because I don't want to feel that old as it would, but I have found there's a lot of these sort of opportunities for young women to sort of in control of their body in different ways, whether it's gymnastics or dance or even just sort of self-expression. It's sort of become a wonderful place to sort of get to take center stage, which is kind of great. It's sort of a democratization of it. I'm sure, though, that there are people who don't like that aspect as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably double-edged sword.
Yes, yes.
Well, just tell us a little bit about writing for the Deuce. And are you familiar with that show?
So okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, the HBO show, the David Simon and George Pelecanos show that's set in 70s New York. It's set in the world of pornography and um and it was really an intense and exciting experience. Those shows that they had done The Wire together and it's Homicide, these very sort of male centered shows and this was sort of they had had some women in the writers room before, but not that many because of the nature of the shows. And so Lisa Lutz, another crime novelist, and I were the two women in the room to speak for women in a show about pornography. So felt very loaded going in, but they were all so great. We were talking last night. Richard Price is sort of one of my writer heroes. I mean, these were all my writer heroes. Was so wonderful, and he had lived through that era and has written about it and really knew 70s New York. But it was felt very important to speak for these women that it starts in the world of prostitution and moves to porn, but to speak to these female experiences there, and to give agency to the women, and it was really exciting to get to do that. And also watch an appalling amount of pornography because you do have to kind of watch it to because you were having scenes where they're shooting it and it has to feel real, and what were sets like in that era, and what it was sort of just figuring itself out as so somewhat ragtag operation. It's not what it is today. Yeah. So it's just you did have to kind of watch Deep Throat and Devil and Miss Jones and all of it. And my one takeaway is it was much better when they got better lighting, because it's just way too, it's like it's like a Walgreens, it's like so unattractive, and just let lower the lighting, it'll look better. But
Maggie Gyllenhaal, God, she was
yes.
something else.
She was a powerhouse on that, and is one of the producers, which was great because she really could sort of put her sway behind it, and it was really important to her, playing someone who moves from being a sex worker to being a director ultimately. And there were a lot of female directors in that era. And she was incredible to watch, and getting to see them recreate 70s New York was just completely intoxicating. And some of it was on sound stages, but some of it's still there, and it was really fun.
Wow. And a lot of it was, of course, about Times Square, right? And the
Yes, and they had to shoot a lot of
crack
it way
arriving.
uptown in Washington Heights.
Is that right?
Yeah, yes.
Instagram, and I got a flash of the book. A big thing for authors now is to give them billboards.
Yes.
Mm.
I would say I would not like to be that large.
Well, now that
Yes,
they're all
yes.
essentially screens, it's
That's
very
right. It's all
easy to,
LED now.
yeah,
It's the
easy to
tragedy
do
of
it.
neon. We lost our neon.
But wasn't that story, I mean, and also about crack, arriving
Yeah.
in the city, and wasn't the story originally meant to go longer?
They had envisioned it always as 3 seasons. I think because they really wanted to get where in Times Square, the sort of hint at the future of Times Square, where it would be Disneyfied and cleaned
Mm.
up, and that was really the story that they wanted to tell about. Most David Simon shows are in some ways about the perils of capitalism, the destruction of capitalism, and to him, this sort of free bohemian space. It was sort of lost under the what would become the sort of Giuliani's Times Square, which was the erasing of all the sort of native culture and putting in Disney. We were back to Florida.
But just moving it over, right?
Yes, yes.
Essentially.
Yes, exactly. Moving it over. When I moved to New York in the early 90s, you had to go over to, oh, yeah, so you had to go all the way over to Ninth Avenue, as opposed to Times Square, which is more on Broadway. Like it kept moving further until it was really in the river. There was a question from the viewer, fan of film noir, wondering if she starts her novels, her ideas with a 1940s reference and then modernized. That's a great question. If I'd ever taken like a 1940s true crime or story and then set it now, boy, I don't think so. But now that's a good idea. I mean, I certainly think I take some of those themes just come having those are the books that formed me. So I think when there's a way to find a way in, certainly. I mean, sort of just like what we were talking about. My next book is really set in Detroit at this moment. That feels in many ways like the 40s, I guess, a sort of big change in the culture and a big shift, and a lot of sort of strife and peril and confusion around that. So, but that's a good idea, because as we were saying, these issues don't go away; they just take different forms. So I'm gonna have to think about that. That's a great question.
Funny, you read the Greeks now and you see film noir.
Yes.
Don Winslow was talking about that, you know.
I remember one of my books I ended up I think it was Forgive Me Your Hand. This was about scientists, but there was I ended up reading a lot of Medea for some reason that just spoke to me. Yes, 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 yes. So I think that's right. And last night we were talking about with Joe Nesbo was here as he's written that version of Macbeth and that how that's the most noir of Shakespeare. And I think I don't think there's any crime writer that's written more than 10 books that hasn't cribbed something from Macbeth.
Well, does anybody have questions?
Is there now a true crime story that you're thinking about focusing on?
Yes, the question is there a true crime that story that I'm now thinking of? Yes, my next book there is one, and it's I'm not going to say what it is because if I don't end up the book doesn't end up working out, I might not do I might want to save it. But there is definitely one, but it's focused on the one that will be set in Grosse Pointe is not a Grosse Pointe crime. It's set East Coast crime, but it's about a group of women. Getting it over their head, let's just say. And I've been very much following this Idaho case, which I think a lot of us have. If you remember, it was just an appalling and terrifying case. And I'm sort of thinking about the possibilities there, which this is this case of what definitely seemed like it had to be a personal case where this sort of house of college students murdered, and everyone assumed it was someone that one of the young women knew or ex-boyfriend, and it's everyone's worst fears. It's a real in cold blood situation where a complete stranger just comes in, and probably too scary for me to write, but
They
I'm
did a
interested in it.
2020 on that, didn't they?
Yes,
Yeah,
and
we saw that.
there's a couple books already in the work, true crime books about that case. So
That's the case for modern forensics. Without
yes,
it,
that's
would really have been able to figure out what happened.
and solid police work too together because of the car. They were able to track the car. So
Somebody broke into the nurse's home in Chicago.
yes, that Richard Speck.
Me of that.
Very much so. A couple in my little group that's what we started to talk about because it felt like that where it was someone just comes in and just one by one. It's just terrifying. It's a great grim final answer for me to give, but yeah.
Speaking of true crime, we're doing, and I wanted to talk to you about that too. Whoever has the podcast, right? Your friend,
Oh yes,
Jen.
in the audience.
I want to talk
yes.
about that. Jillian Lauren, who has written that book about, oh gosh, what's his name? Sam, the most prolific serial killer, and she began corresponding with him in prison and got him to,
Reveal
confess
his,
to
oh
many more.
wow.
And it's about their entangled kind of relationship and its effect on her.
Wow.
And there was a really good. They did I think a four-parter about it.
Do you know this case, Jen? No. Okay.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that. But she's going to be here on July 20th.
Oh, I'm gonna have to look for that because that is really Stranger Beside Me. The Anne Rule book was really about being friends with Ted Bundy before.
Right.
Yeah, working. That's right. I guess friendly coworkers, I suppose, at a crisis center, right? And that I think that stuff is sort of. I mean, it sort of sounds terrible to say, but it's every writer's dream in some ways that you can this sort of because it's access to this story, in a different way. And I think we're always kind of hoping for have a different understanding rather
Right.
than I suppose our profilers understand, which is that seeing them in this sort of different way. And I think that sounds great. I'm going to have to look for that.
Yeah, Michael Connolly wrote the introduction,
Oh,
and it was
excellent.
actually Mitzi Roberts of the LAPD, which was Renee Ballard, essentially his basis for his character. It was her case, and
Yeah.
she kind of this guy had this record going back decades,
Oh boy.
and he always managed to somehow escape, you know.
Yeah.
And anyway, she was the one that finally got him in prison, and it turned
Wow.
out. And anyway, you'll love it. It
Yes,
has
it's
it
right
all.
up my alley. So sometimes I get those calls from this prisoner would like to speak to you. You know, because there's a lot of crime novels in prisons. They will all accept. I guess they're very popular in prison and crime novels. And so sometimes I'll get that call. This prisoner, would you like to speak to them? I'm always a little tempted, and I never do it.
And one in three books was the library, one of them for prisoners and all. And I said, "Are you aware of what kind of books?" We focused on it. It was just a good idea. And they said we could do anything but true.
Yes, that's what I've always heard.
Right,
They
right.
love it.
How long ago was this? A long time ago? Oh, really? What? Okay. Huh. Interesting.
But maybe there was a prison break.
I'm not sure I knew about that. That's interesting.
I think it's nice. I send them all the time. And it can't be how to break out of prison. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. That's right. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
really interesting. Yeah, I know Joyce Carol Oates has taught in the prisons
Yes.
for
I
years.
know a couple people that have.
Yeah,
I think it would be great. I bet you'd always find a good writer.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Give me your hand. That's a true. Yes, that was a true. That was definitely a true crime that I was really interested in. It was actually a merging of two true crimes. So one is a famous Texas case of. It really is true of these two teenage girls, and one of them they're reading Hamlet, and they're reading Claudius's famous speech where he talks about how guilty he feels for having murdered his brother. Spoiler for Hamlet, for people who don't know Hamlet. Uh, but and while they were these two teenage girls were talking about it, one of the girls confessed to a murder to the other girl, and it haunted her. And so that story, there's been a few forensic file cases about that. There's an excellent Texas Monthly piece about the case. And then there was another case in a lab of a murder in a lab between coworkers where the body was hidden in the lab. And so I sort of put those two together and merged them. That I just it's official, so I can report it. So that's now in development for a series with the Rachel Brosnahan, who plays Mrs. Maisel, wants to play the lead in that. I guess she wants to go from lighter to a little darker. So that's in development at Amazon. So for TV, yeah.
Any other projects? I know you've got a lot.
Yeah, I have some. I'm just starting. Beware the Woman. I'll be adapting for a feature script, so that will be fun because I mostly have worked in TV, so I'm really excited about that. Um, and then I'm about to start an adaptation of Todd Haynes' movie Safe, which is one of his early movies. Some of you may know his movie Carol, or this is one of my favorite filmmakers, and this is one of his early movies, and it sort of eerily anticipates the pandemic. It was made in the 90s, and Julianne Moore is sort of a movie that made her a star. And so I'm going to be adapting that for a TV series. So I'm very excited about that.
Well, there's also the John D.
Oh yes, that's right. I have too many projects. But that with George Pelecanos and I are collaborating on adapting a John D. MacDonald novel, which maybe you have here, The Last One Left, one of his standalone novels. So as a limited series, it's a great 60s Miami story of like really one of the most ruthless femme fatales you will ever come across. And she is so much fun to write. She's as bad as they get.
Sounds great. Well,
Yeah. Sure.
My entree to you was Jeremy and the
Great.
favorite turnout. Now I'm working my own library. Those three books, especially the way that you write about girls.
Yes. Yes.
And I know that's not there's a connection.
Huge influence. Yes. Yes, no, that's it's amazing that you say that. So the question is about virgin suicides, and the book and the movie were very big for me. Jeffrey Eugenides is from Grosse Pointe, where I am from, and that novel is set in Grosse Pointe. So for me, reading that in my early 20s when it came out, it was uncanny because it really was my adolescence. And that book is set from the boys' point of view of looking at the girls. And so when I started writing my first novel that wasn't Die Little, but it actually became the end of everything, it really was sort of my wanting to write a similar story in the sort of suburban Gothic like Virgin Suicides, but from the girls' point of view. So it was a huge influence. And in fact, when Criterion reissued Sofia Coppola's version, I got to write the essay that accompanied it, which was a big thrill because I love the movie as well. And the movie is more focused; it's more from the girls' point of view. And I thought so captured just that physicality you're talking about, and the sort of the secret language of the girls in that family who are very isolated in that house and sort of almost like a heavenly creatures, which is another big influence in any kind of way. So yes, Anne Perry, who oh really? Anne Perry made her a star. Yeah. Home. Yeah. Yes, and she was, and then no one knew for a long time, right? I remember when it came out, she tried to hide that she had helped her friend murder her mother, but it did come out eventually. There's a very good true crime book about that. Do you know that one? Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Did you ever meet Anne or talk to her?
Haven't. I do have some friends who had, and she, once that came out, I felt sorry for her in a way because it had been so long ago and she was so young and the case was so complicated. But um, yes, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, she was. I really liked Anne.
Yeah.
We kind of hit it off well. We always had good
Oh,
conversations when she was
good.
here, and yeah,
So I guess it sort of goes back to the prison
right. What you
prison
know,
writers that are criminals coming. Yeah, that's right.
no one's perfect, right? I mean,
That's right. That's right. We all. Oh yeah. Yeah. No,
yeah,
we've really figured out a lot of them in the last 10 years, right? Uh, yes. It's a Lydia Tarr situation.
we have.
This
Thanks
was
so
so
much.
fun. Thank
Yeah.
you. What a great conversation. Yes,
Thanks
thank
everybody
you.
online. Yeah. Do you want to just stay here? Okay.